Well, good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for our attendees to join this, the third of the three webinars that the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies has been holding on socially distanced justice. You're very welcome to this particular webinar, and I think it's going to be a really interesting session. I'm not going to speak for any great length of time at the beginning, simply to say that for those who don't know me, I'm Richard Garside, and I'm the director of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. The whole issues around coronavirus in the context of criminal justice is something that we've been following very closely, particularly in relation to the implications for the prison system. But the purpose of this webinar is to kind of, in a sense, look forward and to explore what opportunities might be possible to coming out of the current crisis to help us to kind of maybe rethink some of our fundamental assumptions about criminal justice, and what opportunities there might be to use coronavirus as an opportunity to just kind of refocus and to maybe move forward on some important areas of concern. And we have an excellent panel, I think, today who are going to be talking about a number of different areas, and I'll introduce them in turn as we speak. But our first panelist, I'm delighted to introduce, is Vera Baird, who's variously been an MP and a minister, and also a police and crime commissioner, and is currently the victims commissioner. And Vera is going to be talking about the implications for the fight against violence against women and girls and related areas. So Vera, over to you, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Richard, and good morning, everybody. And I hope that I'm more visible to you than you are to me. I want to talk about domestic abuse in particular, because that's the one that's hit the heights during the COVID lockdown period. 2.4 million people a year are estimated to suffer from domestic abuse, 6 in every 100 adults, age 16 to 74, and that's about 1.6 million women, about just over 750,000 men. So if we can learn stuff from this lockdown, we will be helping a lot of people. Domestic abuse, what it is not a drunken fight on a Friday, as many people think. It is a deliberate attempt between partners of one to dominate another by using coercive tactics. So obviously, physical abuse is well known. If you want to demean an intimate partner, clearly sexual abuse is an excellent way to do it. Psychological, emotional, financial, separating the person from the people they know, so they have no other frame of reference, nowhere to go. So, you give up work because I can keep you. You don't need any money. I'll look after you. Don't fetch your mother around here. She really doesn't like me, and we're getting on fine. You're not going out on Fridays with all your women friends because they're looking for men, and you're with me. And gradually isolating, always abusing, so that on top of all of that is happening, you're fat, you're ugly since you stopped work, you don't organise anything, you can't think anymore, you're stupid, you can't look after the house, the kids hate you. And people will say to me, why on earth do you stick with that person? All of this, remember, from somebody you loved and somebody who loved you, the most intimate and the most vulnerable place in which you are trapped by coercion. That is what domestic abuse is about. And you will understand readily that it is not easy to get away from that. By the time you realize that it's not 100% your fault, that you aren't the worm that's being described, your self-esteem, your self-worth will have been so significantly undermined that, as he will tell you, you won't be able to complain because no one will believe a word of it. The perpetrator seems to be a perfectly nice person. Now, I'm falling into saying man and woman because, of course, that is what 90% of it is. I do not for 1 minute forget that men are victims. Indeed, when I was PCC in Northumbria, we had an excellent provision for male victims of domestic abuse. But this coercive control model, which is the dominant one, is male on female almost exclusively. So if you think about it, trapped 24 hours a day, as people were during lockdown at the start, with a perpetrator like that, really exacerbates exacerbates what is going on. At least on a normal time, you might be able to go somewhere, but not during lockdown. Claims, crimes, calls all went up. So I think you'll know the famous figure that in one day, the National Domestic Abuse Helpline had about 700% more calls. That's a staggering figure and wasn't sustained, but on average about 50% more calls to all the helplines, and in particular, an increase in BAME women who've been approaching helplines, not yet found its way, either of these, into policing figures, but they are certainly expecting a surge as lockdown weakens. So in a sense, I think you can see that, firstly, domestic abuse has come right up the agenda and more people are talking about it and know about it than ever before. Also, interestingly, lockdown is a kind of metaphor for what it's like for domestic abuse victims all the time, isolated, can't go anywhere, robbed of their independence and their self-motivation. And so what I think we need to do, bear in mind there's a domestic abuse bill in Parliament too, and this is an available amendment, is to ensure that the understanding of this kind of metaphor that the public's got now doesn't fade away. We should have a major public awareness campaign capturing the nature of domestic abuse after this exposure of the public to it, so that we start really as a nation to tackle it, because it follows from it being very hard for a person to get out of an abusive situation, that actually we've got to be aware of it, we've got to be looking for it, we've got to be ready to take a disclosure if one happens, and we've got to be ready and sensed to intervene if it comes to us. So various things have happened that have been very helpful. When you can't get help anywhere, you've got to have help brought to you. And so there was a system myself and the Domestic Abuse Commissioner campaign for, that's begun now, of having training for supermarket and pharmacy staff, because we guess that people are still allowed to go out and do the errands, despite what is their usual state of imprisonment. And so we've got a system that started up. It can get better. I think we need a code word. Very difficult to go out to somewhere when you know you desperately need help and explain the whole thing. Probably a code word for people who don't speak great English anyway. And just so you know that the trained person will, as soon as you say it, take you to a safe space and give you the help that you require, has started a process, not only for that safety, but also for education, of course, across all of the territories. And now we have pharmacies in supermarkets that are helping with this. So a real opportunity, once one's realised, that you can very easily train people to realise and understand what domestic abuse is and how to deal with it in a shop. And you can obviously do it in other businesses, in places of employment, in supermarkets, in swimming pools, and in many, many other places. This is a key change we can bring. And although it doesn't look all that criminal justice related, to be honest, it is, because the numbers that go through to the criminal justice system are small. And that is because the hurdles and the hoops to jump through are difficult. But let me now turn to the criminal justice system and see if there are any lessons there that we can take forward in what I hope will be a revived and a newly galvanised scheme of public thinking about domestic abuse. Here I feel slightly less optimistic. What was good was that the police, who of course have on a general basis less than 20% less crime, and so had more capacity, did start serious proactive policing of the kind that they frequently use with target criminals, going out to serial perpetrators of domestic abuse at home, visiting them, just asking them what they're doing, having a chat, letting them know that they're available, letting the partner know that. Always risk assessed, very carefully done, but a key tool that they have used only very sporadically before, but started to use far more, and one hopes effectively. The courts. We've had special domestic violence courts, now special domestic abuse courts, since about 2004. And it's that specialism that's key, because this matter of domestic abuse is quite arcane, as I've sought to set out to understand. That expertise is not likely to be readily available in specialist courts at this time, when the magistrates are strained. Some of them are older and can't be present, and there are all the issues around social distancing. So instead, priority has been given to domestic abuse in the courts, and that's good, but there are real worries. So first of all, as the recovery goes on, there are process maps, as it were, to build this up again. And this looks like the opportunity of putting the victims at the heart of things. But that hasn't really galvanized well. And we are finding people called to court, sent away, not having their invert, who is a professional supporter, who a vulnerable or intimidated witness is entitled to and should have with them throughout. That process has not been done so well. However, there has been a good government change which has altered the GDPR to allow court lists to be published earlier and to contain for INVERs the name of the complainant. So there is a measure now trying to link back up INVERs and make sure that they can get to court so that there is support. I did hope that remote evidence in a formal way, not online from my house like now, but me as a complainant going to a place nowhere near the court where there is a proper setup for remote evidence, so that the dropout for domestic abuse complainants attending, which is very, very high, might be reduced by removing the fear of the court's majesty, as it were, and overwhelming fear of meeting up with him, or being on the same bus as him, or meeting up with his brother, waiting to go into court, or just being too afraid to confront him. If you go somewhere completely different and sit in a sort of sitting room and give your evidence across the TV link, I had hoped that that might be boosted and that might become a norm that can be at least offered as an option, entirely up to the victim whether they take it on or not. That's not taking off in the way that I hope. Technological problems remain quite significant, and it's been slow, I think, to get to the magistrates' court. Even live links from within the court are much more prevalent in the Crown Court, but I'm optimistic that we might improve on that. Linked to remote evidence is Section 28, which is about children being able to give early evidence by an ABE giving their videoed account of what's happened to them, and then being cross-examined also on video within a reasonable time of having done that first statement. That means that it's all done, statement, cross-examination, long before the backlog in the courts means there's any chance of such a case getting to court, and the child can go on their way. I have been campaigning for that to be just given absolute maximum premium, because the backlogs in the courts, we started off with 37,500. I think the Lord Chief thinks it's 41,000 now, and some domestic abuse cases and some family cases, family abuse cases of that kind, do go into the Crown Court and will join that backlog. It is particularly worrying for children to pass, you know, the year they're 7, the year they're 8, maybe the year they're 9, waiting with the shadow over them. Section 28 needs to be utterly boosted, and I think that message is finally getting through. Question mark about jury trials now, and a very interesting proposition that there might be trial of either way offences, which may well cover, certainly cover some child sexual abuse, some relatively minor sexual cases, and also some domestic abuse cases. It's specific nature, isn't it, that might be a problem. Take away 12 randomly selected people and bring in instead 2 magistrates and a judge. Is the judge going to direct the magistrates as if they were the jury, stay out of it, or are they all going to come together? In which case, are we really talking about trial by judge alone? And the question that's always been asked of me when this issue arises is, would you rather have trial by jury or trial by judge alone? And my answer to that is, it depends which judge. So stuff is happening. I hope that the public awareness issue at the very least can be sustained. And I do have some hope that the imperative of having some technological support and distance evidence can translate from something that it's important to have for efficiency into possibly a new way of thinking about how to protect complainants against the hazards of the court, which has been around, honestly. There have been remote live links for 3, 4, 5 years, but they haven't taken off. This may be our chance. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much, Vera. I was really struck by your earlier comment about how for many domestic violence victims, what we're experiencing in lockdown is what they experience every day. And it's a really kind of striking point. And thank you also for the very interesting thoughts on the opportunities for using technological and other kind of innovations to improve access to justice. I'm sure we'll come back to a number of these questions. And just to remind, we have the Q&A function open. So please do put your questions to the panelists. The second half of this webinar will be wanting to draw in those questions, and indeed, if you'd like to ask a question live at the webinar, that's also a possibility. So do use the Q&A function, and if you see a question that you think is particularly interesting or you'll be very keen to hear the answer to, then you can tick on the thumbs up and upvote it, and that will actually increase the likelihood. Well, that was exciting. It wasn't my motorbike, but it was somebody's. But right, let's move on. So our next speaker is Adam Elliott-Cooper. Adam has worked both as an activist and as an academic at University of Greenwich currently, and has been very active in talking about some of the recent issues coming out of the George Floyd killing and the need to ensure that the police are far more accountable and indeed maybe fewer of them. So I'll hand over to Adam. Adam, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much to the organisers for putting together today's panel. I think it's a really important and urgent set of issues which are going to be discussed this morning. So I guess I wanted to start by talking a little bit about some of the kind of police initiatives that we've been seeing in the run-up to the lockdown and the protests that we've seen in recent weeks. And then I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which those protests have been handled, both in terms of the PR and with regards to the police, but also the physical handling of them by the police. And then I want to talk a little bit about the demands being made by a lot of the protesters, both in the United States, but over here as well, and the ways in which there is significant overlap with regards to those demands, and how maybe we can try to drill down and think about what they might mean concretely for criminal justice reform in this country. So the police, I think in Britain, have been involved in three probably quite high profile initiatives through three, I guess, categories of crime in recent years. I would say that they are, those categories of crime are migration, so criminalising people who are migrants, identifying them as undocumented, particularly, of course, through the hostile environment policy, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. The second high profile one, I would say, is around so-called knife crime or gang crime, which I guess was a war which was redeclared by David Cameron in 2011 in his so-called all-out war on gangs and gang culture. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And the third is the third category of crime is the war on terror and the use of the prevent agenda and the identifying of terrorists. And so all three of these categories of crime, I think probably unsurprising to most people today, are implicated by race. Right? So race helps us to understand or identify who the immigrants are, who the gangsters are, and who the terrorists are. And so race plays a really fundamental role in the construction of these categories of crime. But in a practical way, and I think really importantly, there's huge overlap as well in the ways in which the police carry out the policing of suspected gangsters, terrorists, and immigrants. And that's through not just the kind of policing we might be familiar with in previous decades, but a partnership with schools, with hospitals, with places of work, with employers, with housing associations, lots of different areas of life. And I think this is important because it's one of the ways in which an expanded form of policing, which kind of invades many different spheres of public life, has become to be so normalised that when the lockdown took place, the expansion of police powers meant that they were kind of familiar and perhaps a bit more comfortable with policing the private and the public and the working lives of people identified or suspected of breaking lockdown rules, for which black and minority ethnic people were also disproportionately policed. So, as I'm sure everyone's aware as well, we've seen huge protests throughout the world, but including Britain, over the last few weeks. And I won't spend a lot of time going into detail about the background to that. I'm sure most people are familiar with the police killing of George Floyd in the United States and the context around that, and the harrowing footage that we're all familiar with. But I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we have recently seen the largest anti-racist protests in British history, potentially. And over successive weeks, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people from across the country organised the anti-racist protests. And not just in big cities like Birmingham or Manchester or London or Bristol, but also in small towns and villages in parts of Wales and Northern England, where people have been organising vigils and other forms of political action in solidarity with what's been taking place in other parts of the country and the world. And I think this is really, really, I think it's difficult to not be inspired and energised by that. And I think the second thing about these protests, which is really positive, is the fact that they've overwhelmingly, particularly in the large cities, been organised by very young people. I've spoken to a lot of the protesters. I've been helping to provide, legal observers and arrestee support and all of that kind of stuff. And these are young people who look at me as somebody who's old at 33. These are people in their late teens, very early 20s, haven't really organised protests and campaign stuff before. They're kind of learning as they go, and I think it's difficult to again not be inspired by a new generation of anti-racist activists who are so energetic and effective at mobilising large groups of people. So in the first protest that I was doing the legal observing at, I noticed and was very surprised at how hands-off the police have been. Very, very hands-off indeed. A very thin police presence on the ground. It was almost a carnival-y atmosphere. You had some places where people were speaking. You had some Caribbean elders talking about the Windrush scandal. You had people playing music in other parts. You had community groups like London Campaign Against Police and State Violence handing out PPE. Lots of different it was a very festival atmosphere on Parliament Square or Hyde Park, wherever it might have been. And I think it was around the second or third or fourth protest that I think the patience of the police began to dwindle, and we began to see the kind of policing which we might be more familiar with at large protests, particularly protests where there are significant numbers of young black people. So we saw riot police being used, we saw horses being used, we saw the tactic of kettle and mass arrest being deployed as well. And of course, alongside that, we saw the kind of stories and narratives that we're familiar with. So the idea that riot police, obviously heavily armoured with batons, flanked by officers on horses, charging, of course, unarmed civilian protesters, was a response to some kind of violence. It's not a violence that I was aware of or saw, or any of our legal observers saw, but it was a narrative which the press picked up and parroted quite quickly. And I think what was perhaps most disturbing about this was, of course, the incident that caught most of the headlines, which was one police officer charging so virulently that they knocked themselves off of their horse. The first story which the press picked up on was that protesters dragged the police officer off their horse, which they then had to, of course, do a U-turn of once some camera phone footage emerged of the officer knocking themselves off the horse by riding into a traffic light. But I think what's also really important about this is that once the horse kind of broke free, it trampled on a young black girl, and this young black girl nearly died. She nearly lost her life because of this. And we've barely heard anything from her at all. And I think there was one interview with her on ITV News. The BBC has barely mentioned it at all. And in the interview on ITV News, she said that she had to call the police didn't help her. She had to call the police to try to make a complaint. She's obviously, of course, badly bruised, very shook up. Her mobile phone was smashed to pieces. And she said that the response of the police was, well, if you're so concerned about your mobile phone, why don't you ask your people to pay for it? And so we're seeing here this, I think, a very different kind of attitude from the police, making their kind of being quite clever with the PR and arguing that these mainly often young black protests are being violent, and therefore this charging of police forces is something which is necessary. But also, I think, quite an intimidating approach through the kettling and the mass arrests, taking people's photographs, forcing them to compelling them to give their information to them, and again having this very dismissive attitude to this example of excessive use of force. But the police have been doing other things as well in relation to this. They've been using what are called gang injunctions. So gang injunctions are maybe a bit like ASBOs for those who are unfamiliar with them, or they might be similar to the control orders used in the prevent agenda, which prevent young people who don't necessarily have a criminal record or a criminal or a violent history, but for one reason or another have been put onto the police's gangs database, and it can prevent them from seeing specific people, going to specific places, using social media, a number of different kinds of injunctions. And what the police have been doing recently is identifying people that they say are not allowed to go to Black Lives Matter protests. Two quite high-profile ones are actually well-known rappers, Dutch Avelli and Digger. Very well-known, successful rappers at the moment who have been identified by the police and contacted because they've put Black Lives Matter pictures on their social media. And the police have said, if you attend any Black Lives Matter protests, that will be in breach of your injunction. And the way they're doing that is linking the Black Lives Matter protests to violence. And they're saying that they're going there to engage in violence. So we're seeing the ways in which this policing of gangs and, by extension, particularly young black people, is being used not only to control their kind of private lives, but also to impede on their political freedoms as well of protest. Okay, so finally, I think I'm talking a little bit about, very briefly, just a little bit about some of the arguments that are being made and demands that are being made. Anyone reading the press would think that the main demand of these protests is to remove some statues, and that really hasn't been the case at all. Most of the demands have been around criminal justice reform, and of course on the more radical end, it's been about what we might call defunding of the police, or and this is premised on the idea that we can't solve our social problems through increasing the power of the police and prison system. And so therefore it's a demand of ending this war on gangs, ending the war on terror, ending the hostile environment policy, and rather investing in the community institutions, the youth clubs, mental health provision, particularly for young people, that can help the most vulnerable people in our society before they come into contact with the criminal justice system. And maybe we'll have a bit more time to talk about that later, but I think this is again a really inspiring and important thing coming out of this current wave of protest. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Adam. It was really interesting. I have to say, I myself had missed this issue about the police horse and that particular incident. So it was really good to hear you explain the wider context. There's an awful lot of confusion, I think, in this misinformation that's going around at the moment. So it was really good to hear you talk about that. Okay, so just a reminder, everybody, if you've got a question, do use the Q&A function. That's what we'll be using rather than the chat function. By all means use the chat function, but we're not going to be using that for Q&A. And again, if you like a question or you're very keen to hear it answered, then just click on the thumbs up to give it a bit more of a boost. Makes it more likely that we'll be able to call on it. So thank you very much, Adam. Again, that was a really interesting and really important contribution. I'm going to move swiftly on now to Cathy Evans from Children England, who's going to be talking particularly around well, as the name suggests, going to be talking about sort of the dimensions around children and young people. So Cathy, over to you.
Hello everyone. I should confess that this is not going to be a talk that looks particularly at criminal justice. and I am no expert on criminal justice, although my early years in my career were focused on working with young offenders and secure care, and it remains something that I care about a lot. But I'm no expert compared with our fellow panelists, so I've got lots that I'm learning already. Children England is a membership body for children's charities, and we were founded in 1942 during the war as part of attempts to prepare for the peace and to prepare for creating the welfare state that would follow. So our roots are the belief that charities are stronger together, that they have a strong voice together, and that we need to work collaboratively with government in order to create the kind of public service system and public benefits that children and young people are entitled to. We've always been very proud of those roots in helping to create the welfare state. And our members have worked alongside the public sector, whether that's in care provision, whether it's been in criminal justice, whether it's been in benefits, housing sector. We've worked alongside the state for 75 years in supporting the belief in human rights and justice and public service. As we approached our 75th birthday, we decided to have a look at that welfare state that we had been part of creating. And our members very much being the village around, representing the village around a child that we would hope and aspire to for everyone in every place. And we thought, what's happened to that welfare state? You may be able to see behind me a tree, which I'll explain as we go forward. But we looked at it and we listened to the evidence coming from children, from families. And we said, look, we've ended up with a housing system that makes people homeless, a benefit system that makes people destitute and leaves people hungry. We have schools that still, many of which are great, but still make some people feel like a failure before they've had a chance to succeed. And we have a health system that still separates our mind and our body, and it tends to be focused on illness rather than health. So we knew that there was something really wrong with the welfare state as it had been originally designed. To say that cuts and austerity had cut in deep to the capacity of our public services and institutions to support the people who need them would be an understatement. But we also looked at this tree. This is the tree that we've created to represent the welfare state. We have added in a central branch called neighbourhoods because we felt that that's such an important dimension of shared collective life, and particularly for children growing up. But we looked across it, and cuts have devastated, but I think we also felt that new public management, the marketisation of all of our public services, whether it's the work programme for welfare and benefits, the privatisation of housing, the outsourcing and contracting of the NHS within the NHS, and the academisation of schools, new public management which is obsessed with money, measures and management, is like Dutch elm disease across our public services. And this is something that I know that is applied equally in the criminal justice system. So we thought if we were part of making it, we should be part of improving it. And we are now nearing the end of one of the most exciting things I've done in my career, which is that we've been able to find a group of young people, 26 young people. We looked particularly for young people with experience of poverty, social housing, disability and reliance on the NHS, young people who've been excluded, had difficulty in school, young people with experience of the criminal justice system, young people with experience of the care system, and young people with experience in mental health services in particular. And they are redesigning the welfare state. They are rejuvenating the welfare state for the 21st century, because we never thought that it's been an old-fashioned idea that needed to be consigned to the past, but we do need to revisit both the policy design of these systems and the funding and the practice within them. Those young people are, I'm going to move aside slightly just to show you glimpse that we have running through the trunk of the tree of the welfare state are Maslow's universal human needs. Rather than getting into what new public management has encouraged us to do, which is to segregate and divide and target services according to people they work for, we need to unify that around the fact that every single human being needs home, safety and security, love and belonging, health and purpose, and that those are the conditions for a good childhood for all children. They are also what we need as we go through life. So we believe that if we can review the welfare state and reframe it so that it works for every child, that it will work better for every one of us, whatever our age. I want to share and agree with Adam about in his enthusiasm about the young generation and what they are leading at the moment. I mean, it can be trite to refer to it, but I don't think we should take for granted for one moment what we witnessed last year with Greta Thunberg becoming a world leader and changing the tenor of and priority of climate change. I have young people in that group who blow my mind every time, but at the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdown, we thought perhaps our plans for completing this inquiry would be derailed, and that we needed to make space for delay in our targets while young people adapted to lockdown and the pressures that it would put them through. From day one, they said, no, we need to double down. And there was this message came through within the first week of lockdown from one of the young people in our group. She said, I was thinking that the COVID-19 pandemic is a terrible thing that's gripping the world at the moment. Through the universal nature of this virus, it's putting a strain on all our institutions and testing our country. However, through this, it's highlighting to us what a society needs to function. A strong universal healthcare system, strong communities to support those in need, strong social institutions such as schools, strong civil service, and a strong public broadcaster. A lot of people are comparing our situation to the war, and out of the war came Beveridge's welfare state. The upshot of my very long message is that we should use this time to come up with a clear vision for when we're out to the other side, because I think that will be the perfect time for implementation. That's just one 16-year-old from the group that we have, and they have actually spent their lockdown doing vastly more work and kind of hothousing their thinking with people that they've wanted to hear from. They have researched with young people from all kinds of communities, and they are ambitious for what we should be looking to replace, how we should be looking to reform all of our social settlement, our social contract for every family in the country. And I hope that everyone here will understand how significant that is as the context in which violence, whether it's school exclusions, whether it's poverty, homelessness, how these feed in and are relevant to issues of crime and disorder and criminal justice treatment. I also just wanted to highlight that we are partners in a very recent brilliant piece of news that the People's Postcode Lottery have granted 1.5 million as a Dream Fund award to a partnership of us with Children First Victim Support Scotland, Professor John Devaney, to create the first child's house for healing in the UK. That will be set up initially in Scotland, but we are very much hoping to spread the practice throughout Britain. And that is taking the Barner House model that many people may be aware of through Europe. For any child who's been the victim of violence or abuse, or the witness of violence abuse, the Child's House for Healing will be a child-friendly, family-centred, where appropriate, place that they go straight away. And the therapy and the healing from the harm of that experience starts immediately among the people with whom they feel safe and loved. Then we make the systems come to them. So the medical investigation system, the social work investigations, if that's what needs to happen, police and the court system will come to them in the place where they feel safe, so that they don't have to go to the cold grey concrete buildings. They don't have to sit in the police stations. We can focus on their healing from their trauma and make the response to child victims truly child-centred. So those are two initiatives that we're involved in, and I'm happy to take questions. I have so many other thoughts about this pandemic, and delighted to be able to be here.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And I think there's a question here on the Q&A from I think it's Mary Murphy, about saying Children England initiative sounds amazing. Are there European international networks with which they are linked? So you might want to come back to that, or indeed, Kathy, you might want to answer in the Q&A itself as well. But thank you, and I think it's really helpful to to situate some of these specific criminal justice issues in a broader kind of social and political context. I think that's really, really important. So thank you very much for that contribution. Keep those questions coming in on the Q&A, and again, keep up voting them, those ones that you like or you'd be particularly keen to hear answered. We're inevitably, when we have so many interesting and informed people, we're slightly overrunning on time, but I think that's fine because there's so much interesting content coming up. So I'm going to move straight on to Liz Fekete from the Institute of Race Relations, and Liz is going to be talking about the broader European context for some of these questions. Thank you, Liz. Over to you.
I will also be speaking about the UK, although some people might think we're not part of Europe. We are part of Europe. The Institute, for those who don't know, is an anti-racist educational charity, and we work internationally through our journal Race and Class, in Europe through our research programme, and in the UK we have a free news service which goes out every 2 weeks called IRR News on anti-racist and social justice issues. I first want to say, by means of introduction, that I am not optimistic that we are living at the moment when we can expect governments to deliver on racial justice. Change, if it comes, will come from below, which makes this actually a very dangerous moment because there's so much hunger from change from below and governments are not listening. I'm going to talk about the long-term negative impact of the policing of COVID-19. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about prisons and what's happening in prisons today when prisoners have been locked up 23 hours a day during lockdown. I'm sad that we didn't follow some of the European lead here in terms of decarceration, but I hope that might be something that comes up in question and answers. So I want to talk mainly about the policing of COVID-19, but then I want to make some conclusions from that. I believe that we're facing two epidemics. We're facing the pandemic of this respiratory infection, and we're experiencing an epidemic of racial injustice. And that epidemic of racism is a race and a class issue, which is linked to the structural violence of austerity, cuts in services for the mentally ill, and the removal of support for those with addictions. This has accentuated the use of excessive force within the criminal justice system. Force and violence is being used to solve societal problems. This week, well actually today, later today on our news service, we're releasing a new report on 50 suspicious Black and migrant refugee deaths since 2014 in police custody, prisons and immigration removal centres. What is very significant in the 16 deaths that we have reported in terms of Black people killed by the police has been the use of batons, tasers, cuffs, sprays, dogs and other forms of restraint on young Black men acting erratically but not criminally, who have gone on to die in the custody of the police. And what is significant in these deaths is the frequency in which mental illness and drug possession or addiction are part of the scenario, which ends in death caused by the stress caused by restraint and a lack of care. This goes against the Angiolini review into deaths in police custody in 2017 that said that the use of force and restraint against anyone in a mental health crisis or suffering from some form of drug abuse, drug-induced psychosis, poses a life-threatening risk. So keep a look on our website. That report will be out hopefully by the end of today or tomorrow at the latest. So to turn to the lockdown, what do we know? Adam talked about the expansion of police powers during the lockdown and the disproportionate impact that this had on Black and minority ethnic communities. It did impact, not just in the UK, but around Europe in a disproportionate ways in terms of race, class and immigration status. Now, Vera earlier said, and she saw it as a positive thing, that there's been 20% less crime reported during the lockdown. Yeah, great, positive. So why, if there was 20% less crime, was stop and search used in London by the Metropolitan Police, where there was more stop and search in April 2020 than in April 2019? It just doesn't add up that the police were using their spare time to actually carry out more stop and search, probably on disproportionately on young Black people who live in high-rise estates, and when they venture out, they are subjected to stop and search. We've also had powerful images on social media, on ITV News recently, of people being tasered during lockdown, and all these cases will be challenged. This is also a question of the disproportionate arrest and fines of Black and other ethnic minorities in London. There's something in the newspaper today about that, some really shocking figures. Very much true in other parts of Europe. I saw some statistics recently from Saint-Denis, which is a department northeast of Paris, and it's home to some of France's poorest and most immigrant-rich districts. Saint-Denis accounted for 10% of all fines in France in the first day of lockdown. This tiny area was 10% of fines. But from my research around Europe, the biggest impact has been, or the worst impact, if one can have a hierarchy of impact, but some of the most frightening examples come from migrant communities and the Roma community. Adam set the scene for us here when he talked about the criminalisation of migration. For me, this is outrageous because some of these examples, which are from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, in terms of migrant workers, are people who are picking the crops that are keeping fruit and vegetables on our table during the lockdown. But what we have found is that for migrants and Roma, what they have experienced isn't anything like the lockdown that other people have experienced. It's been a form of targeted quarantine and militarised confinement. When the military builds separation walls and guard checkpoints with guns, when drones with thermal sensors are used to remotely take temperatures of residents in Roma settlements, we are not talking about proportionate coronavirus-related restrictions, but about targeted quarantine and militarised confinement. I haven't got time to go into it, but I've got some shocking examples of what police trade unions have said in relation to criticism of their policing. In France, where there was an attempt to ban police from using chokeholds, the police trade unions actually organised protests where they threw down their handcuffs in protest about these restrictions on dangerous chokeholds. We've also been looking with the monitoring group, which Adam is a part of, the whole question of racial violence during lockdown. Again, Vera told us about the significant priority given to domestic abuse victims, which is great. However, domestic abuse is not the only form of abuse that has hit the heights during the lockdown. Racial violence has hit the heights. Please read an interview on our news service with the monitoring group, which details a shocking rise in racial violence against South Asian communities, including women, mostly single parent women, who comprise 50% of the cases. that they looked at. The same is very, very true across Europe. It's the same patterns. And I should say, I know we've got many people here from Poland in the audience, but a fantastic organisation called Never Again Association has documented COVID-19 racism in a very good report. And I know that their authors are now facing abuse from the far right. Don't have time to go into the policing of the Black Lives Matter protests. Adam has covered that absolutely conclusively. I would say, Kathy, there's a challenge here to the youth and children's sector, because enthusiasm for young people must include protecting them from criminalisation when they express their dismay about racial injustice. It also means in protecting them from violence. And there are some good initiatives here going on in America, and also in Sweden, because in other European countries, we've seen the use of tear gas and pepper spray used against young protesters. Now, as American medics have pointed out, you do not use tear gas at a time when you have a respiratory tract pandemic, because tear gas makes the respiratory tract more susceptible to infection, exacerbates existing inflammations, and induces coughing. Kettling is not a good idea during a pandemic. Mass arrests are not a good idea during a pandemic. The one positive example I've seen from Europe of a children's organisation taking a stand has been Save the Children in Sweden, who've put out a strong statement against the use of tear gas. To conclude, I would like to make 2 points about the power of change and where it can come from. It cannot come today from government. We can expect nothing positive on our racial justice to come from our government. I think in terms of how race relations is viewed, we are going back to the 1950s, where it was very prevalent that you'd see people in power when racism was discussed saying, oh, you know, it's just a perception, it's a feeling, Black people have a chip on their shoulder. The recent review into COVID-19 race disparities, the farce of the government repressing the whole section that pointed to institutional racism, the fact that policymakers have been appointed to the Prime Minister's review, who've talked about anti-racism being a victim agenda and of a grievance culture amongst people who discuss or point to racism is not a good precedent. So the impetus for change will come from below, because only there is there a hunger for change. But that does not mean that those of us in institutions are absolved. We all have a choice. Are we part of the problem? Are we part of the solution? Can we stop the logic where stigmas are placed on communities, whether it's through the gang narrative, through the joint enterprise laws, or the prevent agenda? The positive legacy has to start with reflecting on the importance of the Minneapolis precedent to defund the police and return policing to a community service. What it is telling us is that we need not more force, but more care, which means embracing the positive things that have come out of the mutual aid movement and reversing the damage done to communities by austerity, by cuts in legal aid, by leaving only force and not care, leaving incarceration and forgetting the power of restorative justice.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Liz. I mean, that was really, really powerful, and you know, made me think a lot about, you know, the kind of the potential for reform via the state or outside the state, and that kind of, in a sense, a prevailing concern, not just in the current context, but obviously over many, many years. So thank you very much. Our final speaker is Lachlan Stewart, who until fairly recently was working as an advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, and very pleased to have Lachlan here today, talking to us, really kind of trying to tease out how we turn some of those kind of big ideas and kind of big aspirations for social justice, and how those can be changed into and converted into kind of practical political programs that parties might be able to implement, and that activists and others might be able to influence parties in taking up. So Lachlan, you're very welcome, and thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Richard. I should stress right from the start that I am no longer working with Jeremy or the Labour Party. I don't speak for either of them. This is an entirely personal contribution. But you asked me to come and talk about how progressive ideas or policy changes can be adopted. And the truth, of course, is that there is no single answer or no template for that. And all I can really do is talk about my experience with Labour, where we had formal policy adoption mechanisms. And I don't really apologise for being quite mechanistic in what I'm going to say, because those mechanisms do matter. We had the policy forum, our decision-making bodies like conferences, our processes for adopting election manifestos through, in the Labour Party's constitution, the Clause 5 meetings. And each of these are really important stages in how you might secure an agreement to progress a particular policy. And there are, of course, a huge load of informal mechanisms as well. We're building relationships with the experts or the pen holders of particular policies, and of course the decision makers, the elected representatives. But I think I need to be very clear that the Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party over the last 3-4 years, which is when I had a role in advisory bodies, was a peculiar period. It would be nonsense to suggest otherwise. And the way that we developed and adopted what I think were fairly radically different and progressive criminal justice policies, which was essentially through a subcommittee of the Shadow Cabinet, where we genuinely reflected. I had come down from 15 years in the Scottish Government, working with, for a quarter of that period, working with Kenny McCaskill on the adoption of public health approach to crime for the SNP government at the time. And we sat down and we genuinely looked and said, is the adoption of the public health approach to crime, the presumption against short sentencing, is that something where we want to go? Because it wasn't politically cost-free, it wasn't reputationally cost-free at all. And we sat down, we thrashed that out, we looked at the evidence, and the subcommittee of the Shadow Cabinet and then the broader bodies said, yes, that's exactly where we want to go. And we then set about trying to flesh that out. But of course, different parties have their own mechanisms. Labour Party is only one party, and it's not the governing party. So if what we want to do is set the agenda or paint the background, if you will, of criminal justice policies, then there's a constant drip effect whereby our culture, where our policy, where our discourse is affected and is slowly changed. But that's a bit like building a drip in a cave, building a stalagmite. It's a very long and slow process in most circumstances, and the aim must surely be to ensure that a government of a day implements these policies. I don't entirely share Liz's pessimism, and I'll say why. I absolutely share her attitude to some of it, but I think that there are certain conjunctions of stars aligning right now which make it irresistible for any government to not look, and that's the issue that we're having in this webinar about what these extraordinary times that we're living through mean, and that there are some common reactions to that, but there are some common strands to how you would get any sort of different policy or progression of policy through political parties and into a governing party. And I'll talk about a few opportunities, the necessity to prepare examples, and then the profundity, if that's the right word, of the underpinning ideas about what we're trying to shape, each of which I think is absolutely essential for success in getting change made through the political processes. We work within, you know, overlapping threads, sort of swirling currents of incidents and of ideas, and in any particular policy, we're at a different stage. It might be a judgment, it might be an act of parliament, it might be a manifesto preparation, and the ways of adopting new or developed policies will be entirely circumstantially specific. But the ideas that there are opportunities to seize, that the requirement to development of exemplifications of policy ideas of the sort that we've been hearing about in the previous 4 speakers, and of the underpinning ideas about what it is we're wanting to achieve, are, I think, common to all political parties and whatever time and whatever stage we are at. I think it's important to remember for a government, if the aim is indeed to get a government to implement policies, that the professional policy stream of the civil service, which sits and underpins any political party in government at a particular time, has models of policy formulation, policy review, policy reflection, and policy development. And that those problems are processes and models are essentially triggered by problems in the system arising, because governments are very busy, resources are very limited, and if it ain't broke, nobody's going to want to fix it. And I think what we're seeing today in these extraordinary times, not only of coronavirus, but also associated with that, with Brexit, with the polarization of our political discourse, with a global shifts moving away from Europe and away from the United States in terms of economic and political power into other things. These things align to give rise across policy briefs a new and particular set of opportunities. So the problems that are going to be looked at are where there's a public opinion or concern, where there's a cost implication, and what Vera was talking about the opportunities for taking advantage of technological developments and efficiencies, that they've been knocking around for years, and this might be the moment that they have their moment. Particular incidents or scandals or things that will take an awful lot of coverage, which will lead to a rise in public concern. And I think what we see now is extraordinary. The coalescence of the Black Lives Matters movement, which is triggered in, you know, a long way away in the United States, which has its own very specific issues around race, plus the coronavirus issue, which is disproportionately impacting different minority ethnic groups, has led very directly to questioning about how we police different minority ethnic communities. Very, very, very directly, all very sudden and quite unpredictably so. One of the reasons I wouldn't, you know, I don't entirely share the pessimism is I was hearing Steve Baker, who is the Member of Parliament for Wickham, very much on the right of the Conservative Party, describes himself as Mr. Macho Brexit, and he was talking this week calling for the implementation of the recommendations of the Lammy Review. And no matter what you think about how good or bad or inadequate or great those particular recommendations are, I found it extraordinary to hear Richard Baker calling for their full implementation. And it's a direct response to what's going on now and the problems that have been highlighted and exacerbated by the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And I think that really matters because any adoption of what we might call progressive policies or the development of better policies do need to be underpinned by some very profound thinking about what we want to do in the justice system. What is the model? What is the vision of a justice system? And that needs to be thought through, not just by think tanks, not just by academia, but in a coalition of interests that becomes quite strong. Because I have no doubt that Steve Baker's comments are rather opportunistic, that it matters that he's making them, but they're not necessarily going to be followed through. So some of these underpinning ideas, and I think one of the crunch ones around the criminal justice system is a tension that often exacerbates itself between the victim's agenda and the rehabilitation agenda. And it takes something a little bit, you know, it's very easy to say, well, we really do want to centre victims and their interest in the criminal justice system, but at the same time, we want to have this rehabilitative agenda. How those things are married, because they play coherently, they play out differently, and it will lead to different instinctive responses from those people who are decision makers. But I think that right now, the opportunities that we have in adopting a public health approach to crime overall, and in counter-terrorism policies that we have, what we now see very clearly is that prison really doesn't provide very much of an answer whatsoever. And that's a fairly common perception across the board. And what we're now looking for is coalitions like the people who are participating in this particular webinar to provide the answers about how we address all of these things. And that does take some deep thinking. And I think what we need is some readiness with some examples of how we might be doing things differently, whether that is a sweep of the evidence in these areas, instigating innovative research, preparing pilot studies, so that decision makers and policy formers and policy implementers have in their toolbox a whole set of policies that might be adopted that are different to the ones that we are currently doing. So that's a very it's a very broad subject, and that's as much as I think I can cover in the allotted time. So, but very happy to look at some questions.
Thank you very much, Lachlan. I think that's really interesting and really helpful, I think, to try and kind of ground some of these very important and kind of indeed quite aspirational sort of perspectives in some of the kind of, as it were, the kind of cold political calculations and how best to achieve this. Now, almost inevitably, as I said earlier, we've overrun on that. We had some fantastic contributions, and it's always difficult when you have really interesting people with things to say in one place. It's always very difficult to keep it contained, and indeed some are suggesting maybe we need another event. Maybe we do. What I do want to do is move on quite swiftly now to some questions. And there's a question here which has had quite a bit of a pick up in the Q&A. It's from Jane Dominy, and I'm just going to read it out rather than kind of ask Jane to actually to speak. So I think she has some issues with her kind of broadband connection. But it's a question particularly really to pose to Adam, and it's the ideas about defunding the police and indeed prison service and reinvesting in youth services, health services, and housing are appealing. They also seem to be completely at odds with the current mood. What practical steps can people who support these ideas take over the coming 12 months? And, Adam, maybe you'd like to have a go at kind of answering or offering some views on that.
I think it would be useful to link up what's already happening with this movement to defund the police. There's already a huge non-compliance campaign movements, whether it be Docs Not Cops, where people are not complying with policing in our healthcare system, whether it be ABC schools to stop the criminalisation of young people in schools, whether it be young people suspected of being from an undocumented family, or the use of the gangs matrix, or the so-called public health approach, which tries to incorporate teachers into schools to identify so-called gang members, or the use of prevent in our education systems as well. Non-compliance with these kinds of initiatives, I think, is really important for eroding the legitimacy of this expansion of police powers. And we can also see it, of course, in councils and in housing and many other areas of public life as well. So I think this approach to non-compliance that's already happening, I think is really important for us to link with this these demands to defund the police. I think the other is that, of course, there are other forms of almost more active non-compliance that we're seeing as well. The fact that people are refusing to stand by and simply watch or walk away from abuses of police power. We're seeing more and more videos arising of people, whether it being stopped in their vehicles or being stopped during lockdown, or the use of tasers, as Liz mentioned, all of these types of things. And I think people are not just simply videoing them, but making a lot of noise about them, and again eroding the legitimacy of the police in this regard, and effectively trying to shame the government into some kind of action, which I think is possibly, particularly given their recent U-turn on free school meals during the summer holidays, shame is perhaps the only thing that this government responds to in a positive way. But I think the important thing is we're not seeing we're not seeing an end to these protests. They're going to be again on Saturday and Sunday in central London this weekend. And I think that once concrete demands can be put forward to the government, I think that this is going to be really difficult for them to go back to business as usual if there's the prospect of tens of thousands of people taking to central London every single weekend until a significant change is seen.
Thank you very much, Adam. And I mean, I think also, and the other thing about that question was also related to prisons as well, and that's been a bit of a theme. Liz mentioned it, and Lachlan mentioned it. You know, this issue about the usefulness of prisons and how that could be changed. And just a reminder, we continue to get Q&A coming in, kind of inevitably. Really, we're getting more of a Q&A at the moment from our earlier speakers. If you have a particular question you'd like to pose, in particular to Liz or to Lachlan, then do get those questions in as well. But we're now going to move on, and we're going to actually have a question from the floor, as it were, from Katie McBride. Katie, if you're there, I think a question really which might be of particular interest for one or both of Kathy and Vera to answer. But Katie, if you're there, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and thanks for organising this really fascinating set of webinars. I think it's really important, really needed. My question was about a broadening out of the discussion around domestic abuse. So with the focus on households throughout the pandemic, is there a need or an opportunity to have a broader public discussion or awareness raising of abuse that occurs between those who are not necessarily defined as partners within the current threshold of domestic abuse, but may nonetheless be a victim of domestic abuse by others within that household? And I speak from a perspective of being a criminologist in higher education, and anecdotally and personally, I'm aware of more mature, older students who are women, have experiences of domestic abuse in their history, but the younger students are also sharing with us experiences that you would otherwise define as domestic abuse taking place within their shared households. And there will be numerous other household setups that need a broader discussion, especially now with the tensions and the power dynamics that occur within those households that are being elevated by the current situation.
Thank you very much. I mean, Vera, it's a really important point, isn't it, that actually, particularly in shared households and in other kind of maybe households where maybe there's quite a lot of churn in the household, kind of the issue around sort of domestic-based violence is not just a matter of familial violence, is it?
No, but that, I'm afraid that's not in the definition by any stretch of the imagination, but obviously a very key point indeed, quite separately to reflect on. There's no doubt, though, that domestic abuse embraces more than I've talked about. However, that is the dominant and the most damaging and the most venal and the least attended to, perhaps. But abuse of elders by younger people is also an issue that's emerged particularly strongly during the lockdown. Abuse by older children of parents or adults in the home, you kind of assume that this is to do with not being allowed out or discouraged to go out and turning around, producing immense tensions. There is a cohort also with which I'm quite familiar of basically women who've been victims of domestic violence, whose children with them have turned, as it were, against them in a whole complex of psychological interactions of a declining spiral of well-being nature. There is a lot of of material going on. There are charities that will help with all of this, it is correct to say, and there is a broad enough definition to ensure that we can drive that agenda with the criminal justice authorities, if indeed that is the place to go. As with all kinds of domestic abuse, the real concern is how hidden away this is and how one can take the lid off these simmering pots of dysfunction, and how one can get involved enough, get expertise involved enough in order to bring it into the public arena and to then throw public views upon it, which can help to engender an understanding of its, if you like, simply wrongness. There's no doubt that there are a number of strands of domestic abuse which are not the classic coercive control at all. Yeah, a very real other element that the police deal with quite frequently is males on males, fathers on sons, brothers on brothers, sons on fathers in households. And that domestic bond, which sounds slighter in the student world, but that may be an unrealistic view from an outsider who's long since left the student world behind. But that domestic bond and that hidden nature that follows it are the factors that make it different from more general violence and abuse, and likely to be more insidious and likely to be longer term in its effects. Those are the elements that we've got to tackle and try to understand.
Thank you, Vera. And Kathy, I don't know if you have a kind of a perspective on this, you know, particularly thinking about kind of younger people, because see, they're sometimes the ones who are most at risk, and particularly young adults who might be in shared accommodation as well. I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts to add to what Vera said.
I had lots of thoughts, but particularly by drawing attention to the term household, because I mean, to say that our members are working with and deeply concerned about domestic abuse would be an understatement, and many are working on the bill as well. We have to talk about the housing crisis and how it is compounding and locking people, children, mothers, partners, housemates into situations that they can't get out of. You know, we have 140,000 homeless families with children who are in temporary accommodation as defined when they were locked down in it. For terrifying numbers of thousands of those, they are in office blocks converted roughly and terribly into temporary accommodation with nothing around them, with no control or filtering of who they are in those buildings, with many with babies and small children. You know, we've happily determined that a household is your safe place for this lockdown, and for many the term household doesn't mean anything, or it means a place where they didn't want to stay and didn't want to be in the first place. So that applies to parents, and it applies to young people. We have huge concerns for children for whom household is care, and particularly those who are currently in unregulated care, unregulated settings. I don't want to call it care. Private companies that have provided accommodation and not much else for children who should be in our care system. And that is a burgeoning problem. But for that to be the context in which you have to lock down is deeply unsafe. And we're also, our members are particularly hearing and thinking and concerned about what is widely anticipated to be a likely spike in child protection referrals and investigations as we come out of the lockdown. And that won't be exclusively because of exposure to domestic abuse in the home, but we know that child protection referrals come predominantly from schools, and children haven't been there. So we have huge concerns about hidden harm to children during the lockdown of a whole range of different kinds. And the fact that when that comes to light and people start trying to act on it, we really don't have a strong reason to think we have the capacity in the care system to deal well with that, and to deal with such complex home situations. But there has been a long-standing concern, a really long-standing concern that can only be exacerbated by this lockdown, about the ways in which the housing crisis, the universal credit and inadequacy of benefits lock women into abusive partnerships that they feel they can't take them and their children out of, because they will effectively be making themselves homeless and destitute. And then that gets drawn into the child protection system, where that system says at least we can remove your child and take them away. So we have huge problems here, and the idea that household is a universally recognised and easy concept for children or for adults is really challengeable.
Thank you, Kathy. And Liz, I'm just wondering, I mean, there's we've seen with some of the issues around the kind of ethnic disparities in relation to coronavirus, in the sense that this might be partly related to housing arrangements and housing circumstances, particularly those who are kind of maybe living in very overcrowded and difficult housing conditions. I'm just kind of wondering whether the broader question around sort of violence within a domestic setting, whether there is kind of also sort of a racialized character to that, or there are particular groups who may be slightly more vulnerable, to experiencing these kinds of issues. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that.
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself.
Yeah, you are live now.
Yeah, I'm live. Well, I think I am. Even if I'm pessimistic, I'm still alive. On your question, I mean, actually, I'm really glad that Kathy brought this back to housing, because I was getting a little bit worried that we were sort of almost getting, there was all this thinking in America in the 1950s around the breakdown of the black family. And it felt like we were getting into a bit of a pathology, to be honest. So I'm really pleased that Kathy brought it back to housing. And I'm very pleased that you brought this back to sort of the question around disparities and disproportionality, because I've been longing to answer Lachlan. So this is a kind of a way of answering your question, but getting back to this. You see, it doesn't matter if you're an optimistic or a pessimist. What matters is that you're a realist. And the trouble with the discussion around disparities and disproportionality is that actually it doesn't deliver racial justice. It tinkers around with the system and it reduces disparity and disproportionality. But at the height or at the bottom of the experience for BME communities in the criminal justice system is what you call a swirling current of criminalisation, of young people being criminalised because they live in overcrowded conditions, they live in high-rise estates, in areas that are being gentrified. So actually, going back to the housing issue, it isn't just the question of poor housing, it's living in an area where you're being pushed back and you're being policed in a different way because you're seen as a threat to the gentrifiers. So to the examples that Adam gave about sort of really good initiatives to support, I would actually also suggest that we need to support groups working on what people call the cruise to prison pipeline. Children in bad housing then go to school who aren't eating properly, go to school and are considered disruptive pupils. They are then subjected in schools to restraint measures, to isolation booths before being taken and put in pupil referral units. Those are the children who most likely experience excessive policing. So basically, yes, I think we need to be very, very holistic around this and see the whole picture. There's a group called Black Learning Achievement and Mental Health UK, BLAM, who are working around the cruise to prison pipeline. So just wanted to add them to the groups that people might like to know more about.
Thank you very much, Liz. And Lachlan, we'll come back, I think, to the kind of some of the broader issues in a second. There's a question here from Daniel Pierce Higgins. I just kind of want to read out, and I think it's kind of quite a good question, really, for all the panelists just to reflect on. It's kind of, what are the limits as to how far the criminal justice system can go in trying to control interpersonal behaviour? You know, which I think, again, it's been one of the kind of themes of this session, the degree to which it's about the criminal justice system, the fact that it's broader social systems. I don't know, who'd like to have a go at kind of sort of answering that? I mean, Lachlan, would you like to start on that? Do you have, I mean, you know, I know your general position is more kind of a social policy perspective, which might be helpful in this regard.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the law and justice that regulates our interpersonal behaviours all the time, although it's more often in the civil area. So I think what Vera has been talking about, especially in terms of domestic violence and the criminal aspect of that, make for a very clear case where the criminal justice system absolutely requires to regulate interpersonal behaviours. Those are, and I've heard what Kathy said about households, so it's not an area where I'm fully fluent in the language, but where, you know, within households, forgive me, then the relationship between partners, between a cared for person, whether that's a cared for young person or a cared for old person, there are without question criminal aspects around that, and I have no idea how those are differently expressed within different communities or different population segments. Liz, I absolutely agree with what Liz just said, completely, and I think it's a really good example actually of how single initiatives or little answers to little questions are inadequate. They need to be underpinned by a profound understanding of the entire set of undoubtedly interrelated questions. So I think it's probably my lack of expression and communication that gave rise to that. I hope that's okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lachlan. Would any of our other panelists like to kind of try and sort of answer that question about the limits, what we can actually ask the criminal justice system to do in terms of managing behaviours and what's unrealistic for it to do so? I don't know if anyone's got any kind of any sort of thoughts on that.
I have.
Yeah, Kathy, yes, please.
And I know it was addressed to me in the first place. To be clear, I mean, just in terms of where this sits in my head, this isn't a kind of a well-formulated policy. Once someone has experienced abuse of any of the descriptions that Vera has given, then the role of criminal justice is to come in to protect and to seek justice. That doesn't prevent or police their interpersonal life, and certainly not where that's not reported or reaches the police. One of the reasons that I've spent so much time focusing on what universal services and support should look like, because it's not doing its job well enough at the moment, is because, you know, we won't significantly reduce and tackle violence towards women, violence towards children, violence towards black communities, unless we are talking about and educating about violence with children from the beginning of life, and we're actually moving into a space where we challenge prejudice, where we challenge ideas of power and how to get what you want. You know, the Scottish example of how they started to tackle violence as a public health issue said, look, if we stop looking at this as a crime issue, then we move from viewing it as policing and courts that solve it. And if we think of it as a disease, if we think of violence as a disease and ask, where did you catch it? It is in childhood, it is in what we witness, it's in how we're encouraged to understand our duties towards each other and our behaviours and acceptable behaviours. And so you get to school, you get to understanding and revisiting social work and responses to things like, I mean, I've been a long-term advocate of banning smacking, because it teaches any child that violence is ultimately a way to get control over another person. Not because it hurts and abuses every single child to whom it's done, but because it's a completely violence positive message to give our society, that parents are entitled to do it. And so you know, I definitely don't think it's the job of criminal justice to police our interpersonal lives. I don't like the idea of that society, but I do think anyone who's been a victim of violence has a right to justice and protection, and that is the job of criminal justice services. But preventing that from happening is the job of everything else.
Thank you. And Vera, I know you wanted to say something. If we can kind of keep it really short at this point, because we're right up against time now.
So, I mean, for 30 odd years, the women's movement struggled to get domestic abuse treated as a criminal offence, because it was seen as a domestic matter which wasn't in the public space and shouldn't be given attention by the criminal justice system. But my own take on it is that that was because you need a powerful social declaration that this is wrong and shouldn't happen, rather than because the complete answer to domestic abuse was ever going to be the criminal justice system. It obviously is critical for safeguarding, it obviously critical for safety and intervention when there is abuse in the home. And we mustn't forget, and I'm sure we haven't, but in this context specifically children, so it's urgent and important that authorities are brought in. But I think it's long since been well recognised that the criminal justice system is not the answer to how to regulate this behaviour. You have to look, as I think has just been touched on, at what causes it in the first place and try to counter it. So there is a stronger move toward investment in perpetrator programs, overwhelmingly not to remove investment from supporting complainants, but to look at how behaviour change can be brought about. And I mean, there are an immense number of theories going beyond what's just been said about childhood experience. There is the overwhelming issue of patriarchy. There are also issues about personality disorder. There certainly are issues about generational domestic abuse. All of those need proper investment in social mechanisms to try to tackle this underneath. But, you know, it's an important signal that it's unlawful, and we have courts called special domestic abuse courts, which does make a declaration that it can't happen, because let us face it, it is the dominant part of society that does inflict this violence on weaker parts of society, who are not only physically weaker, but are also socially and in a power base weaker. So we have a lot to make clear as a structured society to condemn.
Thank you very much. And that feels like a very good place to finish. I mean, not a good place in the sense that there's a number of people who had questions that we haven't had a chance to answer. So Becky, Malcolm, Roger, Laura, Serena, Lisa, Anton, Jason, Jennifer, Carol, Sandra, Mary, and others. I'm sorry we didn't have time to bring your questions to the panel. It was just one of those days, really, really interesting discussion. I think it suggests to me that we need to have more of these discussions. So thank you all our attendees. Thank you all our panelists. And that's the end of this webinar. Thank you.